All right, today we're going to talk about this SCR 504 form, which is the contingency on selling a property. So I'm going to share the screen so we can have the form in front of us. The form, you all can all see the form, right?
Mm-hmm.
This form says at the top, buyer sale contingency addendum, amendment to either the SCR 310 or the SCR 300. Of course, the 300, y'all know the 310 is the regular subject to financing contract. The 300 is the condo contract. It's a mystery to me why we even still have that. The only difference in those two contracts is really the word condo on the front page. Otherwise, they're just alike. So I don't know why they don't get rid of one, but nevertheless, they're there. And then it says, or other. What would other be? Well, you may have that form 330, I believe it is the vacant land contract, general contract. It's possible you would have this for that as well. So it could be something other than the 310 or 300. So if it is, you'd mark other and put that in there. Number one says buyer's property. And this we're referring to the property that they need to sell, not the one that they're buying, but the one they need to sell. So you put that address in there, whatever it is. And then the next line is whether it's a primary residence, a second home, vacation home, rental land, a commercial other. What kind of home is it that they need to sell? That's what you check there. It's going to be one of those. And the next line is the property that needs to be sold. Is it a FSBO? Is it under contract which is attached? Is it under contract not attached? And listed by. Typically, there'd be two of these checked. It could be a FSBO, and it could be a FSBO and under contract is attached, or under contract that's not attached. Or it may be listed by a company and one of those others. It could be under a contract attached or under contract not attached. Or it might just be listed by. Could be just be one, but it might be two. Okay? Y'all can stop me for questions along the way if you like. The next is the sale contingency, and this establishes the buyer's sale deadline that's referred to in this form a couple of 3 times. This contract is contingent upon the marketing and closing of the sale of the buyer's property no later than blank calendar days prior to closing date or on the closing date. Either of these that you choose becomes a buyer's sale deadline. The majority of people are going to choose closing date. That's just what most everybody does. But if you want to choose the marketing closing of the sale of buyer's property no later than blank calendar days prior to closing date, you can do that as well. I very rarely see that, but it can be done. But whichever one of these you choose becomes a buyer's sale deadline. Means that they have to have that property sold by that time. If you want to do, know that it's under contract so many days prior to closing, which a lot of people do, you can check that box, but go up at the top and strike out closing of the sale. You put marketing and under contract. Mark out closing of the sale and put under contract of buyer's property, if that's important. And some sellers like that. I mean, some buyers would rather have that. And the sellers like it too because they know that it's already under contract. And a lot of times you want to be able to, the seller of the new house wants to know when it goes under contract. And that's going to be discussed a little later as well. Should the sale of the buyer's property not close by the buyer's sale deadline, which remember is one of these up here, either the closing date or so many days prior to closing. If the buyer's property is not closed by the buyer's sale deadline, the buyer may terminate this contract by notice to the seller, delivered no later than blank calendar days after the buyer's sale deadline. So, what goes here? Typically, 1, most people put 1. So you can put 2, but just know what it's saying. It's saying if the buyer's property is not closed by the deadline, so either by the closing date, which if everybody puts closing date, then you're not going to have a closing date of the new house. You're not going to be closing if this hasn't happened. But Again, most people put closing date, so I suggest putting 1 day in here. So it's saying if it hasn't closed, the buyer may terminate the contract by written notice to the seller no later than 1 day. Let's say you put 2 calendar days prior to the closing date up above, becomes a buyer sale deadline. If you did that, then you put, if it's not closed, but see, you'd have to change this as well, because up there you've changed closing, probably you changed that to under contract. So then if you put under contract there, you need to put it under contract here as well. You got that? Then if the buyer's property is not closed by the buyer sale deadline, the seller may terminate this contract by notice to the buyer delivered no later than blank calendar days after the buyer sale deadline. Again, if you've chosen up here to put under contract, you want to change it here as well. If it's not closed by the buyer sale deadline, the seller may terminate the contract by giving how many calendar days notice after the buyer sale deadline, unless the parties agreed on any of these. Either the cash, the buyer verifies and possesses purchase price, or the buyer's financing is not contingent upon the selling buyer's property. You know, sometimes you have a buyer that can really afford to buy without selling, but they just don't want to. They want to make sure that they are more comfortable having it sold first. If you have a situation like that, you really better pay attention to this and mark these boxes. Whichever one, if your buyer has cash and they can verify that and close, you'd mark that box. If they can qualify for financing without selling their property, you check that box. My recommendation is that you check them both. If you just get the habit of checking the boxes, then you can be safe. You know, and you're not misleading anybody, because who knows? The buyer could get a windfall. Some relative may pass away and leave a bunch of money to them. You don't know. And maybe they can qualify without selling. Now, if you've got somebody that you know absolutely no way on earth this is going to happen, then you cannot check the boxes. But you're opening your buyer up to some problems if you don't check the boxes, and they could do that. Because what happens is, if they could buy without selling, they could qualify without selling, and you don't check this box, they could get pushed out of the contract. So if you check the box, they'll be protected and be able to buy the house, even though they have this contingency. I see some blank faces. Y'all understand what I'm saying? Okay.
Mama Liz, I have a question.
Okay.
Okay, so when the paragraph above, you said to put like 1 calendar day. What did you suggest? I didn't think I heard. What did you suggest for this particular paragraph?
The same thing. Really, it's not.
Same thing? Okay.
Yeah. You know, if you think about it, if you got closing date at the top, if you check the closing date up there, all this is kind of silly, right?
Okay.
So if the closing date is come and gone and it hasn't happened by then one of the parties can terminate by giving the 1 calendar day. So really, that really is all you need in either of those.
Okay.
If no party terminates via the sale contingency, the parties file a contract without a sale contingency. Most people overlook this. It's kind of interesting, I think. In a contract, when it's in all caps, a lot of times all caps and bold, people tend to slide right over it, which is, I think, interesting. But this is important. If no party terminates via the sale contingency, these 2 options above, if nobody is terminated, the parties follow the contract without a sale contingency. Got it? Now, what's going to happen between the effective date of the contract and your buyer sale deadline? What's below is to address that fact. What is going to happen during this time? What is supposed to happen? The buyer shall make only good faith efforts and actions to sell the buyer's property. So in other words, they got to get on with it. They got to get action going and be serious about selling it. The buyer must timely inform the seller and brokers of pertinent information regarding the sale of the buyer's property. So as things come along with selling the property, you need to inform the seller and the brokers about what's going on. That's what the buyer has to do. The buyer shall timely direct brokers or law firms to disclose pertinent information regarding the sale of the buyer's property. That's pretty self-explanatory. And within blank calendar days of the contract, deliver to the seller and brokers copies of each contract for the sale of buyer's property. So this is saying within one works. Within 1 calendar day of contract, the buyer promises to deliver to the seller and the brokers a copy of the contract for the sale of that property. So once it goes under contract, whatever days you put in here, that buyer is supposed to deliver copies of the contracts within that time frame. So you can put 2 days, 3 days, whatever, but typically I see 1 or 2. And the buyer shall, within blank calendar days of closing, deliver to seller and brokers notice that the buyer's property sale has closed. Well, if you have closing date at the top, it's kind of a moot point, right? If you can close them at the same time, and typically that's what people try to do, is close them at the same time. So you can stick 1 day or 2 days in there as well. And the next is in all caps and bold. If the buyer default or breaches these duties, the seller may seek remedies, that is, terminate or litigate, etc. And what is a default or breaches? And this number 3 right here. If the buyer does not do these things, then the seller may terminate this contract or seek litigation. So you need to point this out to your buyer. This number 3 is important and not anything to be skipped over when you're talking to the buyer and explaining this. They have responsibilities under this form. Number 4 becomes what I call a backup clause. Not a backup clause, a first right of refusal clause. In the old day, when I was listing and selling real estate, which was a couple of years ago, we used a form that said that was called our first right of refusal form. If we had a contingency, we didn't have a fancy form like this, so that's why I call it that. The seller may continue to market the property and may accept any offer as a backup contract by using SCR 391. The SCR 391 is the additional clauses, addendum and clauses to a contract. It's like 3 pages long, and it's one that the majority of real estate agents, no matter how experienced they are, they don't even know it exists. So it's interesting that this form definitely refers to SCR 391. So if the seller may continue to market the property, it may accept any offer as a backup. And so they're saying you have to use SCR 391 for the backup, if you're having a backup contract. Note, MLS rules may require categorization of seller's listing as other than active. And Charleston MLS definitely requires that you put it in as pending. You cannot have it still active on the MLS market. So you need to explain that as well when you're going through this. If you have a listing, the seller needs to understand. Most sellers look at this, seller may continue to market the property. Oh, wow, okay, I'll go with this because I can continue to have my property active. Wrong, they can't. If it's in MLS, they cannot do that. MLS requires that you mark it pending. So the next paragraph is very critical if you have a seller. Upon seller delivering notice to the buyer of a subsequent offer from a cash buyer or a subsequent offer that does not contain an SCR 504 form or a buyer sale contingency, the buyer shall, within blank calendar days, choose and comply with A or B below. This is what I call the first right of refusal. So the buyer is given so many calendar days if the seller receives another offer on the property that's acceptable. It has to be a property that's acceptable. It's either cash or one that does not have any contingencies other than sale financing. That's all that they're allowed to have as a contingency.
Mama Liz, I have a question. I'm sorry to interrupt. Would we mark it as pending or active contingent in MLS?
Active contingent. I'm sorry, I'm using the wrong terminology. Good point. Active contingent, because pending means there are no contingencies. If it's active contingent, the hope is the sellers will, agents will continue to show the property. That's the hope. Realistically, if you have buyers from out of town that are here for 1 day, 2 days, you're probably not going to show it. Or you at least call the listing agent and say, on your contingency, on your 504, how many days does the buyer have if you receive another acceptable offer? So if you have the seller, you might make sure that this is a few number of days, like 1, back when I was listing and selling, I always made it like 24 hours, or 6 hours, or 8 hours. I always put a short time frame in there, just so that other people would be willing to still show it. So if you have an out-of-town buyer, you're not going to show a property that's got 5 or 6 days in here. It's just no need. Your buyer needs to find a house. So if you have a buyer, sure, try 5 or 6 days. That's in your buyer's best interest. If you have the seller, don't do that. Okay? Now, what is A or B? A is they have to deliver documentation to the seller that the buyer's property is under contract sale scheduled to close by the buyer's sale deadline with no contingencies other than financing and repairs. Or they remove the sale contingency only if closing of the buyer's property is not required by buyer to obtain the purchase money. So either of those two will exist. Okay? The buyer can choose one of these two if the seller gets another offer. But he has to be able to comply within how many other calendar days is here. Got it? Yeah? Okay. If buyer does not timely, properly comply with either A or B, then the buyer remains in primary first contract position ahead of subsequent potential buyers. And seller may only accept the subsequent offer as a backup contract using SCR 391. I said does not. If they do comply. If they do not comply with A or B, then the party may terminate this contract by notice. So if the buyer complies with either A or B, then they remain in primary contract, and the seller cannot accept any other offers except as a backup. And they again have to use 391 for the backup contract. If the buyer does not do either A or B, then either party can terminate the contract by giving notice to the other one.